All right, so let's get familiar with the star project. Now, of course, since this is the bigger project, I believe it's the biggest one in the course, there's more info that we need to cover as far as starter. Now, I'll start very simply with the public one. Remember, we had the redirects, and that was for the Netlify. So the Netlify and React router would play nicely, and I have covered that already before in the course, so I'll just leave it at that. Then we have index HTML, and in here we really only care about the title. So in this case, it says comfy slot starter. So if you change this around, of course, the title will also change. Now, as a side note, if you do want to get a favicon, you just need to get it online and then replace it. Because at the moment, of course, we just have the React one. So that should do it for the public. Nothing really interesting over there. Then we have a source. So, of course, this is where we'll do all of our work essentially. And in here, like I said, this is much bigger project. So essentially we have way more folders, and also you'll notice that, of course, way more files here as well. Let's start very simply. We have assets. So this is where I keep the images that I will use in the project. So here I have the logo, essentially the comfy slot, and also two hero images. Now, rest of the images, if we take a look at the project, are going to be coming from the API. So I set up my own API where, of course, all the products have the images. That's why when we talk about assets, we really talk about this logo here and then these two images. That's all we've got over there. Then we have components. So, of course, these are all components that we'll use throughout the project. Now, not only I set up the imports, since I avoided to retyping the boilerplate, and of course I'll cover that in a second, but you'll also have the styled component over here. So don't freak out if you go to the components, and then of course you can see the imports. We should be already familiar with that, correct? And then not only there's a boilerplate for the component, there's also some funny looking CSS. Now this funny looking CSS is styled components that I'm going to cover in the next videos, just to give you a general idea how it works. But essentially the idea is following, where once we use styled components, I don't have to jam all my styles in the index CSS. Now you will find some global styling here. Notice here we have some typography stuff and things like that. But when it comes to individual component, we'll set up all our CSS over here. And of course, like I said, I'll talk about it in greater detail in the next video, but don't freak out. This doesn't mean that I already prepared some functionality for you. No, this just means that I placed all my styling right away in the component, and I'm going to cover that, how it works, a bit later. So again, if you visit any of these components, what you'll find there is just some boilerplate, just some basic boilerplate, because again, we have done this already quite a few times. And for the bigger project, if we would have to write all the imports, if we would need to create all our files, if we would need to create all the folders and everything together, you need to understand that, of course, that would add 2 or 3 hours to the project. And I don't mind adding 2 or 3 hours to the project when it comes to functionality, because that, of course, is interesting. But when we talk about boilerplate, I don't really think that you're getting anything out of the fact that you need to create a file, then you need to create a boilerplate, and hopefully you get an idea. That's why, yes, all the components are already prepared for you as far as the boilerplate and as far as the imports. So I'll navigate back to the cart content. I'll just save it. And then if we take a look at the next folder, we can see that it is going to be a context. So yes, we'll use, of course, the context API. Now, why this project is going to be interesting, because we will use multiple contexts. So there's going to be one for cart, there's going to be one for filter, and there's going to be one for products and the user. And you also notice that we'll use a reducer. That's why we have special reducers folder. And in there we have files. We have all the reducers. And here I right away have all the actions. Because again, if you take a look at the actions, I did not really see the point of us retyping this together. So essentially, we have the actions and I have the variables that have the string value. I didn't see any benefit of typing this together with you since we already know how to create them. And now back to the context. First of all, why we use reducer. And the story is somewhat simple, where when it comes to bigger projects, you definitely want to have the structure. And previously, before the use reducer, that was Redux. Now, with arrival of use reducer, it provides that functionality, that structure, because you need to keep in mind that the bigger your project gets and the more features you're trying to add, the easier it is to add some kind of bugs, especially if you work as a team. That's why when it comes to bigger projects, to enterprise projects, there's always some kind of structure. And previously, before user reducer, that was Redux. Now, with arrival of user reducer, you can essentially set up everything using the use reducer instead. But I just want to let you know that technically you could have slapped the use state. So essentially, instead of using this user reducer, you could have set up the state values and you would be in good shape. But you need to understand that, of course, eventually, as your project gets bigger, you might run into some weird bugs because there is no structure. So even though you might be tempted to think, hey, listen, this user reducer is way too much work, you need to understand that it's not because we have a Hello World app. It's not like we have just a simple to-do list or whatever. We have an app where we constantly will be adding more and more features. So in order to avoid introducing some kind of weird and hard to find bugs, yes, there's going to be a structure, which just means that as we're building the project, it might get annoying, especially in the beginning, because you might be tempted to think, hey, listen, I could just add a state value and I would be in good shape. Now, if you're familiar with Redux, you know that there's a store and usually there's multiple reducers. Now, with user reducer, it's somewhat of the pain to have that kind of setup. So instead, we're going to have multiple contexts. So like I said, we have one for cart, one for filter, one for products, and one for user. And also, I would want to mention that technically, we could have set up one global context and then only one reducer. Now, what you need to understand, though, is that this global context would be giant because, of course, we have all this functionality in here. And the same would be for reducer. That's why I split them up, because in my opinion, it is much more easier to navigate around the project if you have separated the concerns. Now, if you need to brush up on user reducer, please do so, because of course, I'm assuming that you're already familiar with basics. You know what are the actions, why we're passing in the state and dispatch, and all that good stuff. Then we have the pages, and essentially these are the same React components. Now, of course, the difference is that we will use them as pages in our React router. So essentially, same components. We have ones that we're going to use in the pages, and then we have the ones that are going to be pages. And I just split them up in the pages directory. That's the only thing that I'm doing. Of course, then we have reducers, which we already covered. We have a bit of util functions, and I'll talk about them once we get there. There's really no point of making it more difficult than it should be. For now, don't worry about them. And like I said, actions, which we're going to use in our user reducer. Of course, app.js. This is where all our application will meet. In this case, we have, of course, the router, the React router, and also some components that I would want to display in every page. Like I already mentioned, index CSS, we have the global styling, but there's going to be specific styling for the components that we're going to set up using the CSS in JS. So style components in this case. And then we have index.js. And in that index.js, notice how I'm importing all the context. So I have one for products, one for filter, and again, cart, user, and also eventually auth provider. So unlike the previous projects where we had one global context and we just wrap the app, in this case, you'll see how we'll nest those particular contexts just because we would want to get some data from one to another one. And when it comes to boilerplate, if you take a look at the any context, of course, there's going to be the actions that we're going to use. There's going to be that specific reducer that is responsible for filter. So, for example, filter context is going to have filter reducer because, of course, I'll use my use reducer. And then we have some initial state, which always is going to be empty object. And then remember the boilerplate. We had some kind of context, whatever is the name. So whether it's cart, filter, or whatever, then we create that context. We have the provider that is responsible for wrapping our application and providing this value, which is just going to be string at the start. And then, of course, we use the children since we would want to render whatever is inside of the component. And then we have our hook. So we have, in this case, use filter context, but then you can already guess that for the user, this is going to be use user context, and then so on and so forth. Hopefully everything is clear. Hopefully you understand the setup. And I guess we'll start by getting to know the styled components.